All right, so the Joe Biden administration is currently seeing some pretty significant shakeups at the highest levels involving his chief of staff position, as Ronald Klain is making his way out the door and is being replaced by essentially what it looks to be a complete fraudster and a corporate ghoul of the highest degree. So, here from Salon, they say new millionaire White House chief of staff built his fortune investing in firms accused of fraud, and specifically healthcare fraud. Okay, so what are they talking about here? They say reports Sunday that President Joe Biden has chosen Jeff Zients to replace outgoing White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain were met with alarm among progressive watchdogs who pointed to Zients' disastrous tenure as the administration's coronavirus czar, as well as his history in the corporate world where he built a fortune investing in healthcare companies accused of fraud. So in other words, ripping off the American people through programs like Medicare. Okay, and obviously Medicare fraud is something I've talked about on this channel many different times before. It is basically baked in within the existence of this program, and it's disproportionately obviously being driven by corporate ghouls and corporate America who are trying to squeeze money out of a government health insurance program in order to profit for themselves. So they say the Revolving Door Project executive director, Jeff Hauser, called the elevation of Zients to the White House chief of staff a catastrophic decision, saying in a statement that, quote, the Biden administration has been at its best when he has been on the attack against corporate excesses that wide majorities of Americans find abhorrent. Okay, that's a good point there, right? I mean, obviously, on policy substance, Joe Biden has certainly been lacking by basically any metric that you want to look at it, whether it's on healthcare or the economy or education or immigration or climate change, or I could go on and on and on for the entirety of the rest of the day. But he's fallen short on the policy initiatives. But some of the best things that Joe Biden has done, where you've seen actually the highest uptick in his approval ratings, were things like the stimulus checks towards the beginning of his administration, even though they were watered down and half-assed and half-measured and all of that stuff, right? That's when he sees his biggest uptick in approval. Or when he goes after, corporate America or some of these companies that are union busting or doing all of these other things and, waving his finger at them and at least rhetorically going after them, right? He won't back it up necessarily on the substance. Like, for example, in the fossil fuel industry, you wouldn't see him aggressively make some sort of a push for a windfall profits tax to actually punish some of these fossil fuel corporations who have been price gouging the American people. He won't do that on the policy substance, but he will turn around and, he'll go out and he'll do a press conference and he'll make some public statements and wag his finger at them, and he'll say, you big fossil fuel companies, cut that shit out, right? Just stop price gouging the American people. That's bad. That's un-American. You're not being patriots, or whatever the fuck, right? Obviously, it's not anything that's going to legitimately necessarily get anything done, but that's where Joe Biden is at his best, when he is trying to use some of that populist rhetoric. So, in other words, making appeals, populist appeals, and railing against legitimate corporate elites who are wrecking people's lives across the country and taking advantage of people across the board, or, making populist appeals to broadly popular economic policies. Believe it or not, that's when Joe Biden is at his best. That's when he has the highest approval among the American people, and that's where you get some good moments there. Now again, doesn't seem like we're going to be getting much more of that type of action if somebody like Jeff Zients is helping to run his administration. So he continued down here saying that Americans are appalled by profiteering in healthcare, true, and Jeff Zients has become astonishingly rich by profiteering in healthcare. Americans are aghast at how social media companies have built monopolies and violated privacy laws. Zients also served on the board of directors of Facebook as it was defending itself against growing attacks from both political parties. Okay, so we have potential healthcare fraud. We have working at Facebook and, basically working for a company that sole purpose is to like propagandize boomers and, in some limited circumstances help to facilitate genocides in other countries around the world. I mean, Facebook is like one of the most evil corporations you could possibly, look at across the board, bipartisan. It doesn't seem like many people like Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg or the way that they are operating that platform. But on top of that, again, we have this connection here to the healthcare industry where he has been basically working alongside some of these healthcare mafias that rip average Americans off and also rip some of these government programs off in order to pad their bottom line. But They continue saying that the revolving door project's Daniel Boguslaw, who also works for The Intercept, and Max Morin wrote for the American Prospect last year that Zients, who was replaced as COVID-19 response coordinator back in April, has controlled, invested in, and helped oversee healthcare companies that were forced to pay tens of millions of dollars to settle allegations of Medicare and Medicaid fraud. Tens of millions of dollars in alleged fraud for the companies that he was working for. And again, not to gloss over this, right? As they point out up here, this was a guy who was basically one of the top dogs in handling COVID, right? So they're going to give a little bit more information on that. But I mean, just think about that at a surface level, right? The guy who came from the health insurance, healthcare companies that are ripping off Americans in multiple different ways and fucking us all up the ass, right? Somebody who came from that industry, one of the most corrupt and rotten to its core industries in the entire country that explicitly exists to profit off of the suffering of the American people, then was appointed to lead the charge on handling COVID. I mean, that's where we're at right now. I mean, think about it. We couldn't get even a Medicare for all floor vote, regardless of all of the, controversies surrounding force the vote and all of that. We couldn't even get a Medicare for all floor vote, let alone getting actual, universal healthcare coverage for every single American across the board during a pandemic where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans have died, okay? And a large portion of those, we've seen the studies that have come out on this, pointing out that if Medicare for all was actually implemented during the pandemic, we could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, okay? And the guy who was put in charge of running this operation here in the United States was somebody who came from the industry that is profiting off of diminishing the quality, the care, the access of healthcare here in the United States. I mean, it's just so absurd at face value. It's brazenly corrupt right in your face. And it's like they don't even try to hide it, right? I mean, it's just this revolving door of corruption that we have in our government. They continue here saying that they have also been accused of surprise billing practices and even medical malpractice, Boguslaw and Morin noted. Taken together, an examination of the companies that made Zients rich paints a picture of a man who seized on medical providers as a way to capitalize on the suffering of sick Americans, and in the end, it seems to have all paid off. And the most egregious violation is documented in a 2015 Justice Department settlement announcement. They added, saying that Portfolio Logic, the investment firm that Zients founded with his own money, agreed to pay almost $7 million to resolve allegations of fraudulent Medicare and Medicaid billing involving a subsidiary. And they say progressives have also been highly critical of Zients' performance in the government. And again, we circle back to this COVID response here. They say in early 2022, Boguslaw urged the Biden administration to fire Zients over his failure to, quote, provide the materials necessary to improve the U.S. response to COVID-19 or the guidance necessary to keep the pandemic under control. And the Zients-led COVID response refused to challenge Big Pharma's monopoly control in the U.S. and globally over technologies that relied on crucially on public support. And as a result, the United States and other rich countries failed to expand vaccine supply sufficiently to meet global need. And without adequate supply, efforts to bolster low-income country distribution and delivery systems consequently have lagged and have been similarly under-resourced. Okay, so a number of different critiques here that they're sort of laying out for us here, right? Number one, just Biden's COVID response. Now, you could, have various different opinions on like how we should actually go about addressing COVID, right? Obviously, Joe Biden at a base level was somebody who was running against Donald Trump in the 2020 election, basically saying this guy's a complete clown. He's irresponsible. He is not handling COVID in any reasonable way whatsoever, which is true to a large extent, right? That's a fair critique to level at how the Trump administration, who was basically going out there and saying, people should inject bleach and whatever the fuck else he was saying at the time, saying that they were not handling COVID in an adequate way would be an understatement to say the least. But Joe Biden was somebody who ran on basically saying Donald Trump allowed however many hundreds of thousands or 1 million people to die from COVID under his watch. And since Biden has taken power, we've seen more Americans die from COVID than under Donald Trump. Okay, so all of these, critiques, I mean, maybe you could say Biden was more effective with the vaccine rollouts or whatever it may be. But I mean, in terms of handling COVID, Biden has not even lived up to his own metrics. Okay, so I think that's a completely fair critique to be leveling there. But then on top of that, the vaccine stuff, I mean, Obviously, I haven't touched on this for a while on this channel because we're so far, removed from this to some extent, and it's not even part of the national conversation anymore. But I was relentlessly talking about this towards the beginning of COVID, when you had a lot of big corporations who were basically trying to keep their patents under control over these COVID vaccines and not allow other countries around the world to produce generic versions of the vaccines so that they could get them to the wider global population who didn't have the money or the ability or the resources to pay some of these big pharma companies here in the United States and Western Europe for some of those vaccines, right? I mean, this was effectively a genocide, you could argue, and how many people died completely unnecessarily or died preventable deaths purely for the sake of big pharma's profits, right? And so not only did Joe Biden enable that, Donald Trump enabled that, and clearly Jeff Zients was enabling that as well as one of the chief COVID czars at the time. But I mean, this was just a completely absurd situation that we allowed to unfold here. And on top of that, it's really just a double slap in the face to not only the people who died, but everybody across the board, because, and especially Americans as well, because we helped to fund the development of these vaccines, right? All of these vaccines, all of the underlying technology that went into not only these vaccines, but a big pharma medicine across the board is largely developed with public support. It's largely funded by the American people, right? And so the idea that like these companies would just be able to gobble these up and restrict the ability for anybody to produce any alternative versions while keeping all of those profits to themselves. It's just an insane way to construct a healthcare system. It's an insane way to try to go about addressing a global pandemic, unless your only goal is profits for big pharma, which is exactly what the only goal actually was at the end of the day. But they continue down here saying that during his time as pandemic response coordinator, Zients was far and away the wealthiest member of the Biden cabinet, disclosing assets worth at least $89.3 million and as much as $442.8 million. Okay, that's how much this guy is worth. And again, he's made a lot of his money by fucking over the American people on healthcare issues. They say, citing the revolving door project's work, progressive strategist Murshid Zahid said Sunday that Zients, as a businessman, embodies much of the corporate misconduct the executive branch led by a Democratic Party ought, emphasis on the ought to be, cracking down on. Are they actually doing that? No, of course not, and they're especially not going to be doing it with somebody like Jeff Zients leading as Biden's chief of staff. But they finish off here saying that with Biden expected to launch a bid for re-election in the coming weeks, the New York Times reported that the president could lean on Zients to help run the government while other advisors focus on the politics of winning a second term. Okay, so just wrap it up for healthcare reform here in the United States, right? I mean, obviously, again, we were never going to get Medicare for all under a Joe Biden administration, right? This is a guy who literally ran his campaign on saying even if Congress, even if the House and the Senate voted through Medicare for all, that he would veto it if it got to his desk, right? So we've always known that this is who Joe Biden is. It's not a surprise that he would hire some, millionaire, multi-hundred millionaire healthcare corporate ghoul to lead his administration. But I mean, again, it's just a slap in the face to anybody who actually cares about issues of corruption or some of these healthcare fraud allegations that have been leveled against this guy, or anybody who even just cares about having like basic competency or having people who are in these top positions within his administration who are actually looking out for the American people instead of for the profits of corporate America. But it looks like this is the direction that the Joe Biden administration is going. Again, nothing surprising, but somehow he's managed to pick one of the single worst people you could possibly pick for this position to now be leading his administration. So terrifying to think about what type of things that we could expect to come out, especially when it comes to healthcare legislation with this guy leading the helm.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying